Vladimir Putin on the red carpet. I want to bring in Mary Bruce, who's in the room. Mary, we learned just moments ago that we are expecting to hear from both leaders that they will hold a joint news conference, and they'll face questions about the future of Ukraine and whether or not they reach terms on a ceasefire.
Can you tell them that?
Yeah, David, to set the scene here for you a little bit, President Trump and Vladimir Putin have been meeting for several hours. I was just told that meeting is still ongoing, but reporters here were just scrambled into this room, told to expect them both to come out and face questions here any moment. The expectation being that we will shortly see President Trump side by side with Vladimir Putin fielding questions from U.S. and Russian reporters. Now, remember what the president had said going into this meeting, that if this did not go well, that he was simply going to walk, that he was going to leave. So that certainly would suggest that there are hopes for signs of progress here tonight, David.
We know, Mary, leading up to today, even on Air Force One on the trip to Anchorage, Alaska, the president was asked how he would define this as successful. He said he wanted a ceasefire, and that if he didn't get one today, that he would not be happy.
Those were his words, David, that he would not be happy. He made very clear, especially even clearer than he had previously in the hours right before this meeting, that how he was going to define success was getting Vladimir Putin to agree to a ceasefire, or at least making significant steps in that direction. Now, he also said that when it comes to negotiating the details of any deal to come after that ceasefire, that would be up to the two countries, up to Ukraine and Volodymyr Zelensky, and up to Russia and Vladimir Putin. But the president making it very clear. He wants to walk away from this summit here today with a ceasefire and then set the stage for another meeting, hoping that what happens today, the conversation they've been having for several hours here, that lays the groundwork to finally get Vladimir Putin, Volodymyr Zelensky, and President Trump all in a room together to finally come up with a way to end this war, David.
Those are the very questions, Mary, that will be asked of both of these leaders when they appear in this room in Anchorage, Alaska, just moments from now. Again, as Mary just reported, reporters from all over the world were just scrambled back into that room a little earlier than had been anticipated to take what they are expecting to hear from both of these leaders and report it back to their home countries. Again, both leaders expected to take questions as well from reporters gathered there in the audience. We've been watching all afternoon here with our live coverage on ABC, the arrival in Anchorage, Air Force One arriving, President Trump on the plane, greeting the senators from Alaska, waiting for Vladimir Putin to arrive. And there you see the arrival. Vladimir Putin shaking hands with President Trump on the red carpet, a very warm welcome. This is the first time Vladimir Putin was invited to the U.S. for a summit, for a meeting of this magnitude in more than a decade. There had been some who had criticized this, saying, why is he being invited to U.S. soil? There were others, though, within the White House and supporters who said, nothing has worked so far. So how do you get to a ceasefire? President Trump was convinced he should give this a try. They walked down the red carpet in front of the cameras, had a photo op at the end of this. You'll see the F-22s as well in some of the coverage here, the images, and then the B-2 bombers, the flyover that happened just as President Trump and Vladimir Putin were standing there. There was a moment when Vladimir Putin looked up to the sky as the B-2 bombers flew over. Another extraordinary, there it is right there. The other extraordinary moment playing out was the motorcade. Just moments after this scene right here, Vladimir Putin invited into the presidential motorcade, the Beast as it's called, a highly secure limousine for President Trump. Vladimir Putin right there riding with President Trump. You could see right through the window the smile on Vladimir Putin's face. Many back in Russia had already been reporting leading up to this summit that this was somewhat of a victory, since the West has been very quiet with Vladimir Putin, has not engaged with him, has not met with him since the invasion of Ukraine 3.5 years ago. President Trump repeatedly saying this was the shot to get a ceasefire. This was his attempt to get things moving towards some sort of an end in Ukraine. Going into this, very honest these last couple of days, the president saying there was a 25% chance that this could fail, but he was optimistic. He said he believed Vladimir Putin wanted to make a deal going into this summit, and we're about to find out if they came to terms. We do know that there was a working lunch planned with larger delegations from both countries, and I'm told that lunch was skipped. So there was the meeting, the summit meeting itself, President Trump, Steve Witkoff, his special envoy who traveled to Russia not long ago, helping to set up this summit, and Secretary of State Marco Rubio also in the room with President Trump. Two other dignitaries with Vladimir Putin as well. So it was called a 3-on-3 meeting, 6 people in that room. And we're about to watch live with the rest of the world what these two leaders have to say. Martha Raddatz watching the coverage all afternoon, joining us as well here tonight. And Martha, also watching the people of Ukraine, President Zelensky, who was promised a phone call from President Trump after the summit, I'm sure eager to hear what they've come to terms on.
I'm sure he is, David, and he has been watching closely. As you know, he was quite upset that they had a meeting without him because it is his country's fate they are discussing. But, you know, President Trump also said one thing in the last few days, and he said he would know within the first 2 minutes if things weren't going well. Well, it's several hours later, so hopefully that is a good sign that they kept talking and that they will come out together. We don't know any of that yet, but we know he passed that 2-minute mark. You also, David, mentioned those stark images that we saw today, really stunning images of Vladimir Putin arriving here in Anchorage on that red carpet, smiling from the beast, the presidential limousine, shaking hands with President Trump, and that flyover, which I think was meant to be a bit of a show of force, also added to the pageantry here. So indeed, I think Vladimir Putin was quite pleased with that arrival. But you did see that warm relationship between the two men, and that may well help in any of these meetings because they do have a relationship. No one has been talking from the Western world, at least very few people from the Western world have been talking to Vladimir Putin since he invaded Ukraine in 2022, and certainly the first American president to speak to him since that time. Obviously, President Trump spoke to him during his first term, but not since the invasion that Russia invaded. And David, I couldn't help thinking truly of those stark images and the stark comparison when we think of that invasion and the city of Bucha, just 30 miles away from the capital city. You were there as well, and images of those mass graves. And today we are seeing this pomp with Russia's president, the man who went in and was responsible for that. David?
Martha Raddatz with us here all afternoon and again here at 6:30. Martha, thank you. For those of you joining us now, about 6:38 here in the East. Many of you would normally be tuning in for World News Tonight. What you're watching is ABC News live coverage out of Anchorage, Alaska. This is the base where President Trump and Vladimir Putin have been conducting their very high-stakes summit. President Trump acknowledged that. Those are the words that he used, knowing that this summit would be somewhat of a gamble going into this. President Trump himself said he's had meaningful conversations with Vladimir Putin along the way, that the words don't always hold up. I want to bring Mary Bruce back into this. She's inside that room. Mary, give me a sense of the room and how quick this scramble was to get everyone back in, because you all learned that there has been some sort of wrap to this meeting and some sort of announcement that they're going to want to make together on that stage.
Yeah, certainly a sign that there's some kind of progress here that has been happening. We haven't gotten yet the official word that this meeting, that this bilateral meeting that has now been going on for over 3 hours, we haven't been told officially that that has wrapped yet. But clearly, as you mentioned, this meeting and their time together was supposed to go on for much longer. They were expected to have that meal together, a bigger sit down between the two delegations. That appears to have been scrapped. All of us reporters who were sitting here, you know, getting our questions ready, waiting, sort of hunkering down, expecting several more hours before we would be in this position, suddenly scrambled, racing in here. I'm surrounded by hundreds of reporters, hundreds of cameras, the U.S. press, the White House delegation, the Russian press, everyone here now sitting at attention, waiting to learn what has happened, what progress, if any, has been made. And as we said, the president had indicated he would simply walk away if there was not something to announce. Clearly, there is now something to announce. It is not just this room that is waiting, it is the world, and it is certainly Ukraine who has the most on the line in this summit, waiting eagerly to learn what has been discussed, what progress has been made. And remember, the president did say that he was going to call President Zelensky as soon as he wrapped up his meeting. Another question that we will have for the president here, David.
Mary, you've covered President Trump for many years. You covered him as a candidate as well, and we both know that he knows what 6:30 means back in the United States, that millions of Americans tune in for the evening news. He knows by calling this news conference now that he'll have additional eyes watching whatever comes of this summit.
regularly, does it a bit differently than past presidents, where he just sort of picks and chooses and calls on.
David, I think I lost you there for a moment, but certainly I believe you were alluding to President Trump's stagecraft. He certainly understands the timing of broadcasts. He certainly knows that if he wants to get a lot of attention and eyeballs, he knows how to do it, and he certainly is doing just that right now.
Mary Bruce, inside the room as we await a news conference, a joint news conference with President Trump and Vladimir Putin, obviously of Russia, for this historic summit on U.S. soil in Anchorage, Alaska. They have been meeting for more than 2 hours. President Putin had said going into this meeting that he wanted to talk about more than just Ukraine. He was aware that President Trump wanted a ceasefire. He talked about the sincerity of that, the energy of that was complimentary to President Trump in the days leading up to this summit, but also said he wanted to talk about the economy, business relationships, and nuclear issues with President Trump as well. Obviously, we'll have to wait to hear what they tell reporters as to what was discussed. You heard Mary talk about the people of Ukraine also waiting to hear if there's been any movement in trying to end this war. I want to bring in Ian Pannell, our chief foreign correspondent. He's in Kyiv. He's covered the war for years now for us. And Ian, I gather many people are up in the middle of the night there waiting to hear if there's been any movement here.
Yeah, that's right, David. I think everyone is fixed onto their TV screens, listening to their radios and waiting to see what the news is, not least, of course, the president of the country, Zelensky, who is promised that phone call from President Trump when this meeting finishes. I think many people were concerned that if it ended quickly, perhaps it was bad news, but if it ends quickly and there's a joint press conference, then perhaps hopes are raised that there could be a ceasefire. But people are going to be very cautious here. They've been burnt before. Ukraine has signed peace deals in the past involving America, involving Russia, that have been broken, promises that have not been kept. So people will want to see the details of this. Stage one, of course, would be a potential ceasefire, but then comes the tricky part of negotiations, potentially a trilateral meeting involving Zelensky, Putin and Trump, but then they've got to try and resolve some of the differences. Russia occupies 20% of Ukrainian land, 1/5 of the territory has Russian troops on it. They're going to have to negotiate what happens to that territory, who controls it, and as well, Russia also maintains its original aims of the war. Set out, we were standing here 3.5 years ago talking to you as the war started, Vladimir Putin saying essentially he doesn't recognize Ukraine as a valid state, doesn't want it allied to the West, doesn't want it part of NATO, and doesn't want it militarily strong. So how are you going to bridge those important differences? Those are the details that will have to be worked out. But if, and it is a large if at this moment, they come onto that stage and they announce that there is a ceasefire, there will be enormous relief in this country. Finally, people will be able to rest, at least for now, and then worry about what comes tomorrow.
Yeah, it's impossible to overstate the challenge that lies ahead, whether there is a ceasefire here or not. Ian, something that you just brought up, which I think is really important for our audience, is just to remind them of where this all stands. Of course, Americans have been deeply following the war in Ukraine since the invasion more than 3.5 years ago. And Ian, as you point out, Russian gains, they are now overseeing, if you will, or in control of, at least for now, about 20% of the eastern part of Ukraine. Vladimir Putin has signaled that he doesn't want to give any of that up. In fact, there are a couple of areas where he wants more territory. And of course, President Zelensky has said that territory is rightfully belongs to Ukraine and the people of Ukraine, that the Constitution wouldn't allow him to give that up, even though Russia made gains after the invasion. So again, if, and it's a big if, they announce a ceasefire here today, it would seem there's going to be quite a challenge when they get President Zelensky, President Putin, President Trump to a table, if that's what potentially is coming next here.
Yeah, it's a huge gulf. It's not just that Vladimir Putin wants that territory. He also changed his constitution. He now enshrines Ukrainian provinces, think of them like American states, as part of Russia. So that would mean rechanging the Russian constitution to relinquish that territory. which seems unthinkable. I mean, Russian troops are on the front foot, on the front lines in the east of the country at the moment. They're not taking huge amounts of ground. The front lines have moved marginally over time, and Russian troops are slowly advancing at a cost of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of lives to Russia and to Ukraine. But nevertheless, Ukraine is stretched very, very thin. The flow of weapons, the flow of defensive weapons and offensive weapons has slowed down. Those long-range weapons that President Biden agreed to give to Ukraine has effectively stopped. So President Trump has not authorized those long-range weapons to continue to flow. So Ukraine's ability to defend itself has been weakened. Ukraine knows it's on the back foot, but again, Zelensky is in the same position. His constitution enshrines the integrity of Ukrainian land, and that's something that the Europeans have been trying to stress to Donald Trump, that you can't negotiate away the territory. So how do you resolve that? How do you recognize somehow that Russia occupies parts of your land and have a lasting peace? And again, I go back to peace treaties that have been broken before. Ukrainians mistrustful.
Ian Panel in key for us. Ian, we appreciate your reporting, your insights today, and of course for years now covering this war. So many of us on this team have been to Ukraine a number of times. Martha Raddatz included in that. I've been there. We've brought the broadcast there many times during this war, interviewed President Zelensky in the middle of all of this. And again, as Mary pointed out earlier, President Trump did promise President Zelensky during conversations earlier this week that he would call him after this summit wraps up to give him a readout of what played out. We did show this video. I want to show it again and again. This is a live picture. The moment those two leaders walk out, we will carry it live, so you're not going to want to tune away. We'll hear from them if there's been progress made here today in Anchorage, Alaska. But moments ago, we got images in of Vladimir Putin. It appeared to show him leaving the summit after more than 2.5 hours or so with President Trump, 2 delegates with Vladimir Putin, 2 delegates, Steve Witkoff and Secretary of State Marco Rubio, with President Trump. I would gather they're preparing to now come out onto that stage in front of the International Press Corps. Rachel Scott is in that room. And Rachel, it's my understanding when we saw everyone sort of hold up their phones there for a moment, I think people at home watching this live might have wondered, does that mean the president's coming out? But Steve Witkoff, the special envoy who was in Russia, helped to set up this summit, who was there again today, was walking into the room.
That's exactly right, David. It was the special envoy, Steve Witkoff, who walked into the room. He sat in the first row there, and there are still several seats that are empty. Witkoff actually just left the room right now, a sign that it's very unclear when exactly this potential press conference is going to be starting. This was a complete and total scramble, the timeline shifting up, the White House calling on officials and calling on us to quickly assemble and come into this area and wait for the arrival of President Trump and possibly President Putin. We did notice that they were doing mic checks on 2 of the podiums that are here. Steve Witkoff played a very critical role, as you mentioned, David, in setting up today's summit and today's meeting. I traveled with the president on Air Force One here to Alaska, and it was notable just how aligned his message was with our European allies following a big call that they all had. The president telling me that today his goal is to get Ukraine and Russia to a table to negotiate a ceasefire at some point, but it would be up to Ukraine, and it would be ultimately their decision to decide if there are any territorial swaps. Of course, we have heard from Ukrainian President Zelensky. He has been adamant that that should not happen unless there are security guarantees, which the president says that he is open to. David.
Well, Rachel, we have our normal viewers who are watching at 6:30 and those around the country who've tuned in a little earlier than normal because of our live coverage here tonight. And in reading the tea leaves, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves too quickly here, Rachel, but just reading the tea leaves, President Trump said going into this summit that if it didn't go well, he could potentially walk out, return to Washington, but that even if it didn't go well, he would address reporters at least on his own. And the fact that you point out that they tested both mics, that the media has been told to expect a press conference with both leaders would portend perhaps some movement here on trying to get some sort of resolution to get everyone to the table here.
Yes, David, and I'll tell you that even 20 minutes into the flight on Air Force One, we did get a surprise visitor. It was the President of the United States. He suddenly came back. He spoke to reporters, and he was very clear that he would be willing to walk out of this meeting if he did not get what he needed or did not hear what he needed to from the Russian president. So the sign that, and the fact that this has now gone on, I was in that earlier spray inside of the room when we saw these two leaders sitting side by side. I shouted several questions at President Putin about a ceasefire and if he would stop killing Ukrainian civilians. Putin did not respond, although he did appear to whisper something back to me. But just the sign that this has lasted this long is a sign that there could be potential progress at the very least. Either way, the president said that he was prepared to come out here and address the cameras, and now we're waiting to see if President Putin is going to join him, David.
Rachel Scott, part of our team right there in Anchorage, Alaska. Mary Bruce also in the room. And Mary, I see people holding up their cameras right now. And of course, that there you go. Some of the dignitaries now entering the room. Sergei Lavrov among them, right there in the front row, part of the Russian delegation. Steve Witkoff, we know, entered the room, then left the room. We were getting sort of a play-by-play. Susie Wiles, the chief of staff for the White House, entering the room now. Secretary Bessent, Treasury Secretary Bessent, among others there, part of the U.S. delegation. Of course, in Anchorage, Alaska, for this historic summit with Vladimir Putin. The defense secretary as well. You heard Martha Raddatz talk earlier about how President Trump had said going into this that he would know, and fairly quickly, if there was going to be progress with Vladimir Putin. Halfway through the week, they did lower expectations a bit, saying that this was going to be, in some ways, a listening exercise. But the president remaining optimistic all week long, and even on Air Force One, as Rachel Scott just reported, she was on Air Force One traveling with the president. He sounded optimistic as well. He believed, he said late this week, that Vladimir Putin was coming to this summit because he wanted to make a deal of some sort. President Trump confident that, and there you have Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who was also in the room with President Trump and Vladimir Putin, along with Steve Witkoff. Of course, we'll learn more about what played out in that room. More than 2.5 hours, this summit in Anchorage, Alaska. We were told that there would be some sort of a working lunch, working session of sorts with larger delegations from both countries that would follow the summit itself between these two leaders. We were told that was scrapped. And as we've been reporting here, reporters from the International Press Corps were scrambled, if you will, told to get into the press room more quickly than they thought this would come for this joint press conference. And again, we have been saying here that President Trump had, leading into this summit, said that at the very least, I will address reporters on the backside, even if it's not about what I want it to be. I will take questions from reporters in that audience, but they have been testing both microphones. You can see the Russian delegation there in the front row. Every indication, obviously, is that we're going to hear from both of these leaders on a day when the timing of this was moved up. The working session that followed the summit was scrapped. It would appear, and I don't want to get ahead of ourselves here, that there has been some sort of progress in this effort to try to get to a ceasefire. And again, President Trump has said repeatedly that the ceasefire was very important to him, and a ceasefire today. But he also acknowledged that the
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States of America and the President of the Russian Federation
of the United States and Vladimir Putin taking the stage. Let's watch and let's listen. We'll report on the backside.
Уважаемый господин президент, дамы и господа, наши переговоры прошли в конструктивной и взаимоуважительной атмосфере, были весьма обстоятельными и полезными. Хотел бы еще раз поблагодарить моего американского коллегу за предложение приехать на Аляску. Вполне логично встретиться именно здесь, ведь наши страны, хоть нас разделяют океаны, на самом деле близкие соседи. И я, когда мы встретились, вот, вышли из самолетов, я так сказал: добрый день, дорогой сосед, очень приятно видеть вас в добром здравии и живым. И по-соседски это очень звучит, по-моему,
And I think that's some kind words that we can say to each other. We're separated by the Strait of Bering, though there are two islands only between the Russian island and the U.S. island. They're only 4 kilometers apart. We're close neighbors, and it's a fact. It's also important that Alaska has to do with our common heritage, common history between Russia and the U.S., and many positive events have to do with that territory. Still, there is tremendous cultural heritage back from the Russian America. For example, Orthodox churches and a lot of more than 700 geographical names of Russian origin. During the Second World War, it was here in Alaska that was the origin of the legendary air bridge for the supply of military aircraft and other equipment under the Lend-Lease program. It was a dangerous and treacherous route over the vast emptiness of ice. However, the pilots of both countries did everything to bring closer the victory. They risked their lives and they gave it all for the common victory. I was just in the city of Magadan in Russia, and there is a memorial there dedicated to the Russian and the U.S. pilots. And there are 2 flags, the U.S. flag and the Russian flag. And I know that here as well, there is such a memorial. There is a military burial place several kilometers away from here. The Soviet pilots are buried there who died during that dangerous mission. We're thankful to the citizens and the government of the U.S. for carefully taking care of their memory. I think that's very worthy and noble. We'll always remember other historical examples when our countries defeated common enemies together in a spirit of battle camaraderie and allyship that supported each other and facilitated each other. I'm sure that this heritage will help us rebuild and foster mutually beneficial and equal ties at this new stage, even during the hardest conditions. It is known that there have been no summits between Russia and the U.S. for 4 years, and that's a long time. This time was very hard for bilateral relations, and let's be frank, they've fallen to the lowest point since the Cold War. I think that's not benefiting our countries and the world as a whole. It is apparent that sooner or later, we had to amend the situation to move on from the confrontation to dialogue. And in this case, a personal meeting between the heads of state has been long overdue. Naturally, under the condition of serious and painstaking work, and this work has been done in general. Me and President Trump have very good direct contact. We've spoken multiple times. We spoke frankly on the phone. And special envoy of the president, Mr. Witkoff, traveled out to Russia several times. Our advisors and heads of foreign ministries kept in touch all the time. And you know fully well that one of the central issues was the situation around Ukraine. We see the strive of the administration and President Trump personally to help facilitate the resolution of the Ukrainian conflict. And his strive to get to the crux of the matter, to understand this history, is precious. As I've said, the situation in Ukraine has to do with fundamental threats to our security. Moreover, we've always considered the Ukrainian nation, and I've said it multiple times, a brotherly nation, however strange it may sound in these conditions. We have the same roots, and everything that's happening is a tragedy for us and terrible wound. Therefore, the country is sincerely interested in putting an end to it. At the same time, we're convinced that in order to make the settlement lasting and long-term, we need to eliminate all the primary roots, the primary causes of that conflict. And we've said it multiple times, to consider all legitimate concerns of Russia and to reinstate a just balance of security in Europe and in the world on the whole. And I agree with President Trump, as he has said today, that naturally the security of Ukraine should be ensured as well. Naturally, we are prepared to work on that. I would like to hope that the agreement that we've reached together will help us bring closer that goal and will pave the path towards peace in Ukraine. We expect that Kiev and European capitals will perceive that constructively and that they won't throw a wrench in the works. They will not make any attempts to use some backroom dealings to conduct provocations to torpedo the nascent progress. Incidentally, when the new administration came to power, bilateral trade started to grow. It's still very symbolic. Still, we have a growth of 20%. As I've said, we have a lot of dimensions for joint work. It is clear that the U.S. and Russian investment and business cooperation has tremendous potential. Russia and the U.S. can offer each other so much in trade, digital, high-tech, and in space exploration. We see that Arctic cooperation is also very possible. And our international context, for example, between the Far East of Russia and the West Coast of the U.S. Overall, it's very important for our countries to turn the page, to go back to cooperation. It is symbolic that not far away from here, at the border between Russia and the U.S., there is a so-called international date line. I think you can step over, literally, from yesterday into tomorrow. And I hope we'll succeed in that. In political sphere, I would like to thank President Trump for our joint work, for the well-wishing and trustworthy tone of our conversation. It's important that both sides are result-oriented, and we see that the President of the U.S. has a very clear idea of what he would like to achieve. He sincerely cares about prosperity of his nation. Still, he understands that Russia has its own national interests. I expect that today's agreements will be the starting point, not only for the solution of the Ukrainian issue, but also will help us bring back business-like and pragmatic relations between Russia and the U.S. And in the end, I would like to add one more thing. I'd like to remind you that in 2022, during the last contact with the previous administration, I tried to convince my previous American colleague that the situation should not be brought to the point of no return when it would come to hostilities. And I said it quite directly back then that it's a big mistake. Today, when President Trump saying that if he was the president back then, there will be no war. And I'm quite sure that it would indeed be so. I can confirm that. I think that overall, me and President Trump have built a very good, business-like and trustworthy contact. And I have every reason to believe that moving down this path, we can come, and the sooner the better, to the end of the conflict in Ukraine. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. President. That was very profound, and I will say that I believe we had a very productive meeting. There were many, many points that we agreed on, most of them, I would say, a couple of big ones that we haven't quite gotten there, but we've made some headway. So there's no deal until there's a deal. I will call up NATO in a little while. I will call up the various people that I think are appropriate, and I'll, of course, call up President Zelensky and tell him about today's meeting. It's ultimately up to them. They're going to have to agree with what Marco and Steve and some of the great people from the Trump administration who've come here, Scott and John Ratcliffe, thank you very much. But we have some of our really great leaders. They've been doing a phenomenal job. We also have some tremendous Russian business representatives here, and I think, you know, everybody wants to deal with us. We've become the hottest country anywhere in the world in a very short period of time, and we look forward to that. We look forward to dealing. We're going to try and get this over with. We really made some great progress today. I've always had a fantastic relationship with President Putin, with Vladimir. We had many tough meetings, good meetings. We were interfered with by the Russia hoax that made it a little bit tougher to deal with, but he understood it. I think he's probably seen things like that during the course of his career. He's seen it all, but we had to put up with the Russia hoax. He knew it was a hoax, and I knew it was a hoax, but what was done was very criminal. But it made it harder for us to deal as a country in terms of the business and all of the things that we'd like to have dealt with. But we'll have a good chance when this is over. So just to put it very quickly, I'm going to start making a few phone calls and tell them what happened. But we had an extremely productive meeting, and many points were agreed to. There are just a very few that are left. Some are not that significant. One is probably the most significant, but we have a very good chance of getting there. We didn't get there, but we have a very good chance of getting there. I would like to thank President Putin and his entire team, whose faces, who I know in many cases, other than that, whose faces I get to see all the time in the newspapers. You're almost as famous as the boss, but especially this one right over here. But we had some good meetings over the years, right? Good, productive meetings over the years, and we hope to have that in the future. But let's do the most productive one right now. We're going to stop really 5, 6, 7,000, thousands of people a week from being killed, and President Putin wants to see that as much as I do. So, again, Mr. President, I'd like to thank you very much, and we'll speak to you very soon and probably see you again very soon. Thank you very much, Vladimir.
Next time in Moscow.
Oh, that's an interesting one. I don't know. I'll get a little heat on that one, but I could see it possibly happening. Thank you very much, Vladimir. And thank you all. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
As we wait to see if the president will take any questions from the room. There you have it. Vladimir Putin first addressing reporters, then President Trump addressing reporters as well, talking about what he called, this is President Trump, an extremely productive meeting. That's how he characterized the summit. He said, many points we agreed to. There are some points left, including one point that's pretty significant. Did not go into detail about what that point was. He did say we're going to save thousands of lives, and he believes that President Putin wants that as well, but didn't clearly say flat out that they have agreed to a ceasefire that begins, whenever. That was not declared by either one of these leaders. He also said that he would be contacting NATO and calling President Zelensky, as we had been reporting in our coverage earlier today. President Trump earlier this week promised that he would call President Zelensky after this summit. So a clear indication from President Trump that that call has not happened yet, though he fully intends to do so. He also intends to call his European allies in the EU, leaders of, I gather, the UK, France, other countries that have been involved in the coalition that has supported Ukraine from the very beginning. I want to bring in Mary Bruce, who is in the press briefing room. And Mary, if you can hear me, I'm just bringing the audience up to speed here on what we have just witnessed here together live on the air. Again, President Trump calling this extremely productive, saying many points agreed to, some points left. He said one point is pretty significant, but he suggested that perhaps we could get there. I did not hear, and correct me if I'm wrong, I did not hear any declaration of a ceasefire.
No, you certainly did not, and I have to say, I don't think I've ever been left after hearing from the President of the United States with so many questions. They both came out in these short remarks suggesting that progress has been made. Vladimir Putin using the word agreement, saying, I expect that today's agreement will be a good starting point. The President referencing the fact that they aren't quite there, which hinted at the point that they didn't get, it appears, the full ceasefire that President Trump was hoping for, but he kept alluding to this progress. What is the progress? That is the big question, and one that we still do not have the answer to. This was incredibly vague, and I have to say, with quite literally the entire world watching, with the future of Ukraine hanging in the balance, to not have any clarity here is pretty astounding. Now, President Trump said he was going, obviously, to be speaking with Ukrainian President Zelensky. He was hoping that coming out of this meeting that they were going to have a ceasefire and that he was going to be announcing a trilateral meeting, that he was going to be announcing that they were finally going to get Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky in the same room. It seems we are still a ways away from that, David.
So, Mary, perhaps I'll give you a little break here. For our audience at home, we're going to stay on the air through 7:30 Eastern here for another 20 minutes or so. We're going to let our White House teams do some reporting here in the meantime. Mary and Rachel Scott are also traveling with the president to try to see if we can get some clarity from the White House about what this agreement is, because you did hear Vladimir Putin there at the top of the press conference, as Mary just alluded to, and I heard it as well. Vladimir Putin saying that they had reached an agreement, though he did not offer any details of what this agreement would be. Vladimir Putin talking about the relationship U.S. and Russia, the chilliness to that relationship for a very long time. He said it was time to re-engage both countries. He talked about Alaska too, by the way, and the history of Alaska, which, by the way, was sold to the U.S. back in 1867. Many of you have read that in the coverage leading up to this summit. Sold for $7.2 million back in 1867. Talked about the history of Alaska, the common heritage, he called it. Vladimir Putin then went on to talk about the economy and about trade with the U.S., talked about the trustworthy nature of the conversation with President Trump and the others who were in the room from the Trump administration. And he used the word agreement. We all took note of that. The control room did as well. And we were hoping that when President Trump began speaking, that perhaps he would shed some light on what this agreement is. So when President Trump began speaking, you all heard it with us at home. He said it was an extremely productive meeting. Many points agreed to, some points left. And I have the actual quote here because I think this is the most clarity we had from President Trump. We had an extremely productive meeting and many points were agreed to. There are just a few that are left. Some are not that significant. One is probably the most significant, but we have a very good chance of getting there. I guess my notes were pretty close to what the actual quote was. Martha Raddatz, our Chief Global Affairs anchor, is on the ground in Anchorage. And Martha, we knew this would be high stakes. President Trump used those words going into this summit. And as of now, there is not much clarity as to what this agreement that Vladimir Putin noted is. And certainly they did not use the word ceasefire.
They did not use that word at all, and that's what President Trump said. Unless he had a ceasefire at the end of these meetings, there would be severe consequences. It certainly doesn't sound like anything like that is going to happen. But as Mary said, it was completely vague. I think all of us were sitting there waiting for Donald Trump to announce just what an agreement was, if there was an agreement, and we got nothing. In my notes, David, I have that Donald Trump said no deal until there is a deal. So that's probably the firmest thing he said, that there was no deal, even though he said there was progress in these several different points. And, you know, obviously the Russians have several sticking points. Ukraine has a lot of sticking points, and we don't know exactly what Donald Trump believes was agreed upon in this meeting. But it does not sound, and he certainly did not announce any kind of ceasefire, and that is what Donald Trump said he wanted, and it doesn't appear that's what he got. Is there progress in that relationship? Vladimir Putin seemed very happy about the meeting and getting to meet with Donald Trump again. You heard the president also bring up what he calls the Russia hoax. That in 2018 is what he talked about a lot. But this meeting, there is so much at stake. The future of Ukraine, people on the ground, war, and the incredible toll that war has taken over these past 3 years. So the call to Zelensky, I don't think he is going to be pleased about that call, because just listening to Vladimir Putin say how the relationship has changed and that they're talking again is not necessarily going to please Zelensky. David.
Well, Martha, your notes match mine. I have here no deal until there's a deal, according to President Trump, and that he then went on to say, I will be calling NATO shortly, and I will be calling President Zelensky, of course, of Ukraine. And as I had mentioned, there had been a conversation earlier in the week involving President Trump, European leaders, and President Zelensky, during which President Trump promised President Zelensky that he would call him right after the summit. President Trump telling the world that the call hasn't happened, though he fully intends to do that. I want to bring in our chief foreign correspondent, Ian Pannell, because, Ian, you were watching this play out live right along with the rest of us. You've spent a lot of time in Ukraine. What did you read into what you heard? And you and I were talking before they came out on that stage and talked about the fact that Russia now has 20% of Ukraine's territory. And obviously that falls into the category of what we think we heard from President Trump here. Points left, one pretty significant point. I would gather, once we learn the details of this, the significant point likely involves much of that land and who is going to get much of this 20% of this territory that Russia fully intends to hold on to, and that Ukraine has signaled it's not willing to give up.
Yeah, I think there's far more that we don't know than we do know after that press conference. I think many people were sat, glued, watching the TV, waiting to hear what the announcement was, and are rather perplexed now. I think the cynics would say there was much ado about nothing. There was no mention of a ceasefire, and for now the war continues. There's no indication that the guns will stop firing, the drones will stop flying, the ballistic missiles will stop landing on civilian buildings across the country, and the trenches will continue to shoot at each other on the front line. So there's no, at the moment, in the details that we have, there's no indication of an immediate relief for the Ukrainian people. President Zelensky will be waiting for that phone call from Donald Trump to find out what it is that they did discuss. As you say, Vladimir Putin indicated there was an agreement. President Trump didn't go that far. He said there's no deal until there is a deal. So what are the details? And if you can't even get to the first stage of agreeing, which is what Ukraine have been pushing for, with American backing, with the backing of the so-called coalition of the willing, Britain, France and Germany, as well as other allies, that you start with the ceasefire and then you go on to negotiate all those difficult details about what you do with the land that Russia's occupying, what do you do with the 20,000 children that have been taken by Russia, how do you resolve reparations and all those issues. That was supposed to be the way that this happened, but they didn't. As far as we understand, even get to a point where they could agree a temporary ceasefire, a temporary cessation of hostilities, and that is going to be deeply disappointing to many people here. If you're sat at home with your children close in arms, worrying about whether or not the drones will start flying again tonight, you just heard no relief at all.
So again, 7:16 here in the east. We're going to stay on the air until 7:30 to see if we can get any more reporting on this. Ian Pannell, of course, our chief foreign correspondent, who is in the capital of Kyiv, reporting on how Ukrainians are likely going to receive this news, that even though President Zelensky was not at the table and they were not happy about that, they were very hopeful that President Trump would be able to convince Vladimir Putin to at least establish a ceasefire. President Trump made that very clear on Air Force One again today on his way to Anchorage, Alaska, that he wanted the ceasefire and he wanted it today. And he said if there wasn't one, he would not be happy. Here is that quote. I asked for a full readout. I just want to make sure that everyone's up to speed at home on this. This is the quote from President Trump a short time ago. There were many, many points that we agreed on. Most of them, I would say, a couple of big ones that we haven't quite got there, but we've made some headway. So there's no deal until there's a deal. I will call up NATO in a little while. I will call up the various people that I think are appropriate. And of course, I will call up President Zelensky and tell him about today's meeting. And so ultimately, up to them. Up to them. And Mary Bruce, our chief White House correspondent, I want to go back to you in the room. Obviously, the major unanswered questions. We heard Vladimir Putin use the word agreement. Any more reporting on what that could entail? And then obviously, President Trump, you know, I also take note, it's very rare that President Trump would hold a sort of a news conference like this and then not take any questions on the backside. You know, there's a critique of all sorts of critiques of presidents in the past, some who wouldn't take questions, some who took too many. That is not something that people have critiqued President Trump for. He often takes questions, and it was quite notable that he left the stage even though there were questions being shouted out and did not take any of them.
Yeah, it is incredibly rare for President Trump to come anywhere near the White House press corps and not take at least a few questions, especially on such a grand stage as this, when he knows that everyone is waiting and trying to figure out what came of this meeting. And we are still trying to get clarity on that. I can tell you our entire team is frantically trying to figure out what progress has been made. You heard Vladimir Putin, as you said, mention that there's been an agreement. The president, you read that quote from him. He went on to say, we didn't get there, but we have a very good chance of getting there. Well, we still don't know exactly what that means. What remains to be worked out? What was the progress that was made? And you have to remember that going in to today's meeting, the president was well aware that he was facing a lot of criticism and pushback and concerns that he was already handing Vladimir Putin a win simply by meeting with him, simply by essentially bringing Vladimir Putin out of the isolation that he has faced from Western leaders for the last 3.5 years since he invaded Ukraine. Vladimir Putin today got a lot of what he wanted. He got this huge photo op, that friendly welcome from President Trump, the two of them rather chummy on the red carpet on the tarmac earlier today, then meeting one-on-one for 3 hours. More than that, Vladimir Putin had a chance to discuss other issues we know beyond Ukraine with President Trump and his delegation, things like nuclear arms control, trade, economic cooperation. It appears for now he still doesn't have to have a ceasefire, and that is something that Vladimir Putin certainly does not want right now, even though Ukraine and Western leaders are trying to up the pressure on him to do that. And as Martha and you were discussing earlier, for now he avoids those punishing sanctions. It was just a week ago, last Friday, that was supposed to be deadline day when President Trump was threatening to put new punishing sanctions on Vladimir Putin. Instead of that, he has avoided those sanctions. He has gotten this one-on-one, face-to-face to make his case on Ukraine and a host of other issues to President Trump, and he still does not have to, it appears for now. He hasn't agreed to a ceasefire, David.
That's right. So just let's underscore this for a second here, Mary, because again, Mary, you were reporting for the days leading up to this, and in fact, there were the sanctions that were set to go into effect. Suddenly, the sanctions did not happen. President Trump announces this summit will happen instead. Vladimir Putin would be invited to American soil for this summit. The president making the argument that nothing has worked until now, that this is worth a shot to bring him here to America, to give him this invite. The sanctions were taken off the table. Then this week, in your reporting and in others from our team, President Trump did say from the White House that if there was not a ceasefire, if there was not progress, there would be, in his words, severe consequences. So that remains, again, the sanctions, the threat of potentially severe consequences. You have to put that up against the signal that we heard from President Trump about some points left. One of them's pretty significant. The president also looking past sort of the conflict in Ukraine, talking about better relations and in particular business relations with Russia. We didn't hear about sanctions or severe consequences, and we didn't hear, obviously, about any agreement in the short term for a ceasefire.
That would be easiest to come up with.
No, we did not. And look, the president had said, you know, that if they didn't reach a ceasefire, he would put in place those punishing economic sanctions, even though President Trump, by his own admission, has previously conceded that sanctions really don't bother Vladimir Putin. They haven't certainly done much to move the ball in the past, but he was promising that if they couldn't reach a ceasefire here, that there would be consequences. That's one of many questions remaining here. Will there still be those consequences? And of course, he also said that if they didn't reach a ceasefire, he was going to walk away. Well, it certainly didn't look like he was walking away. Based on the brief remarks that we heard here just moments ago, it seems like he is saying, you know, let's still give this a go, even though the president clearly didn't get exactly what he wanted here.
So many questions here, Mary. Just get our control room's attention if you hear anything back from the White House. I know you've put in some calls just to see if we can get some clarity. Mary, thank you for your reporting. Rachel Scott will be traveling. She's in the press pool, traveling with the president back on Air Force One if and when he takes flight to get back to Washington. And she was able to get questions to him on the way here as well. So perhaps that will be a window into what we're dealing with here, what we should be reporting on as far as what's been achieved or what hasn't, quite frankly. I want to bring back in Martha Raddatz because, Martha, not only have you and I traveled to Ukraine, you recently were in Russia. You witnessed in that country what it has been like with Vladimir Putin not getting the attention of Western leaders. He hasn't since the invasion of Ukraine. And you juxtapose that with the images of him arriving in Anchorage, Alaska today, a very warm welcome embrace on the red carpet, and perhaps one of the most telling images that actually just sort of traveled the world almost immediately was Vladimir Putin's smile through the presidential limousine when he got into the what's called the Beast with President Trump to travel to the summit together. It would seem, at least as far as that's concerned, the PR part of this for Vladimir Putin is exactly what he was looking for.
I think it's exactly what he was looking for, David, especially, as you said, in the backseat in the Beast, alone with President Trump side by side in the U.S. presidential limousine. Now, in Russia, when I was there, he had the military parades there that are an incredible sight to see, lots of goose-stepping soldiers. I also, on that day in May, interviewed Dmitry Peskov, his spokesperson, and I asked him about those sanctions, and just what Mary was saying. He said, well, I understand there's pressure to speed up the process, but you know, it's very hard to threaten Russia with sanctions. We are a country that is not loaded and is not overloaded by sanctions. We are the country that's experiencing maximum sanctions, and we're a country that's used to living with sanctions and used to living with sanctions quite well. Now, just walking around Moscow, it's a beautiful city. There's no question about that, but people are suffering. The economy really is suffering there. People are suffering. So he may say that again and again, and it was pointed out to me, well, look, you know, Starbucks left, but we've replaced it with Stars Coffee. We're doing just fine. But you really dig deeper there, and there is truly an economic crisis. But Vladimir Putin doesn't seem to care about that. And if there was no ceasefire today, and if, given what President Trump said, he's now dodged those threatened sanctions, rather, a couple of times, David. Last Friday, when he agreed to this summit and said, you know, the deadline's passed, but we'll have this summit together. And today, if there is not an agreed upon ceasefire, and as Mary said, it does not appear to be the case today, then where are those severe consequences? So there are so many questions left, David, and so much to learn for the rest of the world, and especially there in Ukraine.
So on this point,
David.
Martha, just before I let you go here, we have a few seconds left on this point. No deal until there's a deal, President Trump said. He said many points left we agreed to, but some points left. One point is pretty significant, he said. But Martha, we know President Trump said going into this, he wanted immediately to set up a second meeting, a second summit with President Zelensky and Putin. Didn't hear the word ceasefire, said there are points outstanding, so it would seem any hope of this secondary meeting feels a ways off here.
It sure does, and he is talking to President Zelensky. I'm sure President Zelensky was glued to the television set watching to see what was happening here in Anchorage, but it really does seem a ways off with that meeting, and you know, is it the land swap they're stuck on? David?
Our Chief Global Affairs anchor, Martha Raddatz, who is in Anchorage, Alaska, will be anchoring a special edition of This Week on Sunday. I thank you for being here on a Friday night. Our coverage continues on ABC News Live, abcnews.com. From all of us at ABC News, good night.